Hello and welcome to Essence of Wonder. This week again without Gadi Evron. I'm Alan Bond and I'm joined with Karen Castelletti. And this week we are looking forward to talking with Lindsay Ellis.
Lindsay is the author of the New York Times bestseller Axiom's End and its sequel Truth in the Divine. She graduated with a BA in Film Studies from NYU, an MFA from USC in Cinematic Arts, and has been involved in numerous streaming projects, mostly on film criticism. Previously, she was a finalist for the Best Related Work in 2019 with Angela Meehan for their work on the Hobbit duology. And we're so excited to have her with us today.
Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm tempted to start by asking about your cool alien light on the wall behind you.
Oh yeah, you mentioned Angelina, who was my co-finalist. She, I guess, kind of one year found this Etsy store based in Hungary that made neon lights, and so she got that one for me. It turns purple when it's on, but I don't think it looks very good right now because the sunlight's basically on it.
Awesome. And one of my favorite things about doing, films from people's houses is just seeing the cool stuff on their walls.
Yeah, you can see a dog there, and also
some
mess.
What's the dog's name?
Collie.
Oh. All right.
So,
she's kind of old, so although she's a Boston Terrier, they don't really get old. They just go at 100 until they die.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, I really have enjoyed reading your works, both Axiom and Truth in the Divine. And I know that you have a real big love of Transformers, and I was wondering whether the alien design that you have, or more about their personalities than their actual physical design, had any relationship to various Transformers.
Not specific Transformers, but I think in terms of world building, if there was any influence, there are these because I like the movies are garbage, and we can all love them for what they are, but they're like not very deep. But the comics are actually really good, and so I guess the critical darling is called More Than Meets the Eye, and it ran from about 2011 to 20, like in its predecessor, I think like 2017. So it ran for about 5 years, and I guess it was much more traditional, like sci-fi in the way that it was structured and the way that it did world building, and kind of introduced this actually did kind of play with the idea of like gender and social structure and how evolution plays into like how culture develops and how civilization develops, and also religion for that matter, and like how do robots conceive religion differently, and then they have like debates. And so that if there was like any influence in like, I guess the biggest influence on the way it was written was that, because it's like pulpy, but it's also really good. Like even people who don't like Transformers like those comic books. So like if you are looking for something that's like fun and pulpy but also smart, More Than Meets the Eye and its sequel Lost Light, or its follow-up Lost Light, I think it's about 100 issues.
I actually hadn't realized that there were comics, and I'm so excited to go check them out.
Yeah, the comics are actually like it's a universe, like, because it started with Marvel Comics back in the 80s, and like even back then the Marvel Comics were like, well, this is what the adults read, we don't mess with the children's cartoon. And so after that it was sort of IDW bought the rights around like 2006 2007, right around the time the first movie came out, and IDW was like, okay, we're gonna take this seriously now, and with varying degrees of success, but yeah, I think for the most part it's they've done some really good work with it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I completely agree with your assessment about liking the movies for what they are. They are visually very fun, but
yeah, they're dumb as hell. But I'm still kind of obsessed with them, like, because I think somebody kind kind of accused me of like both of my books being beat for beat just the first two Transformers movies. And on the one hand, no, but in some ways, yes, because they kind of deal with a lot of the same stuff. Specifically, the second one, like being about how Earth responds to the fact that like first contact has happened. And, you know, the
Right.
second movie is like one of the worst things that's ever happened to this planet, you know, like Transformers 2, like it's just because it was written by Michael Bay. That one like was produced during the writer's strike of 2008, and so officially he didn't write it, but really he did. And you can tell, and it's just like the sort of like clumsy, angry way it's you know, set up and portrayed, I just think is really fascinating, because it's like you had an interesting setup and you did nothing with it. So in that way, yeah. I'm always kind
Well,
of
but
responding to Michael Bay
you
in my
did do a
head.
lot. You did do a lot in that second book and explored a lot of deep, dark concepts, looking at suicide and trauma from multiple directions, and really getting into how people interact with those kinds of feelings.
Yeah, I'm like, why didn't you deal with Bumblebee's PTSD, Michael Bay? Stop.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because PTSD is a big part of what you do deal with, both in terms of Cora and in terms of Obelus in that second book, and how they're interacting with all of the feelings that come out of that first book.
Yeah, I guess I feel like there was a time when that wasn't super common, but it's becoming more and more trendy in terms of like dealing with mental health in genre fiction. I guess the most obvious example of that lately would be WandaVision, where and basically everything that's kind of come after Infinity War is we've seen a lot of this, like, okay, now let's seriously deal with the fallout of like this collectively traumatic thing, which is Thanos' snap, and you know, half of everybody is dead, and then 5 years later they're back, and like both of these things being like you know, incredibly upset. And you know, I think where, you know, in a Michael Bay universe, you just kind of ignore that and move on. The way they've decided to, you know, work with it, which I think is resonating with people, is like, no, let's take it seriously. Let's, you know, seriously investigate how this would you know, impact society, and how on an individual level, you know, people with powers kind of go through their own mental health crises. Again, WandaVision being overt, but you know, Loki does it a little bit, and I kind of suspect that we'll be seeing more and more of that. So yeah, that was kind of like the direction I was going in. So I guess I'm kind of vindicated that pop culture and genre fiction is moving in that direction.
I was going to say, do you think that that's been influenced by the last, you know, 2 years and, you know, lockdowns and pandemic?
Sorry, you broke up there. What was that?
Oh, sorry. I was saying, do you think this more of this growing focus on mental health in stories is related to, you know, the timing of the pandemic and lockdowns?
Maybe. I think it was kind of heading in that direction anyway. Um, I I feel like maybe WandaVision was no, definitely production written before lockdown. And if anything, it really hurt the show. You can kind of tell where like they had to cut production around like halfway through, and you can really tell with like Monica Rambeau's subplot. You're like, oh, this was hastily rewritten.
Right.
Oh yeah.
So I think maybe that like
I've seen
influenced
that.
interest, but I think it was kind of heading in that direction anyway.
Yeah, I think it might. My thought is that it might be more related to the big wars we've had in the Middle East, and all of the veterans coming back and really dealing with the mental health crisis of that return.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you look at like in the 80s, we were kind of having that discussion with Vietnam, and especially like the Rambo movies, but you know, the way it was being dealt with was like sympathetic, but maybe not, you know, the most helpful. Like, you know, because at the end of the day, it's like, are the point of the Rambo movies you can shoot your way out of trauma? No, but they kind of eventually did become that, because that's just where the culture was at. And I think now it's different because it's like, in a way, I think a lot of there's less sympathy for troops than there was for troops in Vietnam in the 80s, but there's more interest in how PTSD manifests and what it actually looks like, and how it can have similar, like, people who are victims of like sexual abuse and emotional abuse can be similar to people who actually participated in a war and went through a war.
Mm-hmm. While we're sort of on the topic of timing and setting, I was curious, why 2007?
Well, whenever I was like seriously reworking this, it was kind of like, like so many fiction is kind of set in like the nebulous now,
Yeah.
present day. When Trump got elected, I was like, this does not make any sense. This cannot, this story no longer makes sense. So it had to be a period piece. And I thought that, super mega first, it was 2009, and then I decided it wasn't very interesting for it to take place during the Obama presidency, and so I bumped it back a couple years and basically started playing with the idea of like the being largely informed by the fact that, like, in the universe the stock market crashed earlier than it did in real life, and how people, we know it was inevitable, like in the real world, but how people could like kind of wrongly assign that to like, certain political movements, or the aliens did it. And, I feel like, given how silly everything has become, that feels more and more plausible.
Mm-hmm.
With the third wave, as you've portrayed them in the novels, do you think that's influenced by more of the stuff that's been happening recently in terms of like the Proud Boys or anything like that?
Well, it was more based on the Tea Party,
Okay.
because that also kind of rose in response to TARP, and like the original bailout, which was kind of in motion before Obama got elected. But these people still blamed it on Obama, and also just this idea that, like, the Democrats were going to tax us more, which of course they didn't, but that was sort of like being the underlying belief system, and that being really highly motivating, because, like, in this book, like, there are like hate groups in the super mega background, but they're not really mainstream yet, because that was how it was back then. And most people at the time, like even up as recently as like 2014, 2015, just thought this idea that like neo-Nazis and hate groups could become seriously mainstream was just absurd. Like, it was ridiculous. Like, that's not going to happen. That's in the 1940s. And so, like, the main political force in this hate group, they're just sort of like hey, we have legitimate grievances and here's what they are. And and they needed to have a point. They needed to have like thought behind their belief system. It couldn't just be like mindless bigotry. Even if there are some kind of mindless bigots that kind of hop on that bandwagon because they see an opportunity to move the Overton window. But yeah, it was more based on like stuff that was happening at the time.
Absolutely. And I think you kind of touched on this a little bit, but what do you think would have changed about the narrative if it were set 10 years later?
It's so silly, I can't, like, it's just like, I know that's like saying that about like aliens and like ET heart bonds and stuff, but like the thought of during the Trump presidency is just like, it just feels like farce to me, because like whatever he would have done would have been just, it would have read like comedy. But like the book isn't comedy, so it's just like, God, that just would not have worked. I've had to like get the government out of it together and just kind of like, well, you know what? CIA is basically autonomous anyway, and that's kind of why I structured it the way I did. So
I love the implication that it's the actual president who's farcical, not the aliens. They can come at another
right.
time.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Speaking of the CIA, you put Cora in a situation where she has to basically face off with the CIA and U.S. generals and take them on in a room and really represent the Obelis's thoughts and translate for him. Ampersand, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, mixing things up. Obelisk is the antagonist in the first book.
The antagonist.
But no, yeah, ampersand. How did you come to that structure, and what went into figuring out how a 21-year-old would deal in that situation?
It's interesting because I get such like mixed feedback on that. Some people think that she's like too whiny and incompetent. Some people think she's like too competent. I feel like she's a lot more competent than I would have been at that age. Way more to get held together than I would have been. But I also, kind of feel like that might be true of Zoomers in general. I think they do have to grow up a little faster, even though Cora's not a Zoomer, she's a millennial. But at the same time, it's just I like the kind of, there's this sort of trope that you don't see too terribly often, that the asshole government agent who eventually have to learn to work with. That was kind of like semi-popular in the 2000s. Like Hellboy does it, Transformers 1 does it. And like that's where Saul came from. And it's interesting because that seems to be kind of a controversial character, but it's just like he's one of my favorite characters. He's like much bigger character like in the second book, and then like even more so in
the third book. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah. It's just I feel like government agent is kind of a staple with the genre, and so it's kind of a question of like what new spins can we put on it.
Yeah, I mean, in that first book, you sort of had two different CIA agents that you're balancing against each other. There's Saul and there's
the good
Vincent
cop,
Parr.
good cop, bad cop.
The good cop, bad cop. And it's interesting that by the end you sort of have put your own little twist on that, and develop that a little further. And I think Cora's relationship to Saul changes from the first book to the second book. Like by the end of the first book, there's this sort of, they've got a place where they're working together, and then in the second book that all changes.
Yeah, because like about like halfway through the second book, they're not officially working together anymore, but they still kind of like come together through circumstance. And that kind of keeps happening repeatedly, and it was complicated by the fact that he has this really contentious relationship with the other point of view character, who's a journalist, and they just really, really hate each other. And it's also kind of a question of like, well, what does he feel about her? And I think even he doesn't really know that. I think he's one of those people that just kind of acts and doesn't really think about why he does what he does whenever he treats people a certain way.
Yeah. Speaking of that journalist, I think you mentioned in the afterword a little bit about how you came up with that character, Kaveh, and how you worked a lot of the cultural Farsi and Persian culture into the book. Do you want to talk to that a little?
Yeah, because I can't remember why I decided he was Persian. It might have been simply just because like the real Kaveh and I like hung out at some point in like 2014. But whenever like the super original version of this book was like very different. Like the political movement wasn't like really political. It was more like in the vein of Scientology. It was more cult-like, which, in hindsight, I was like, didn't really work with the universe. And, the sort of like Kaveh character was originally two characters. Part of which the reason was like, because Cora was younger. And one of them was like the love interest who was younger, and the, mentor figure who was a recovering alcoholic. And then like, once I scrapped that version, they kind of became one character. And because she was like slightly aged up, I was able to age him up to to a point, because he's in his mid-30s, and like the point where I could believe that he was like very accomplished, and had actually himself been through a lot of these had gone through like addiction and rehab therapy, and like all his personal tragedies, and while at the same time, like, being a very accomplished journalist and a Rhodes Scholar, and getting his PhD, and writing several books. So, being a land of contrast as a person, which I think if you're in your early 20s is super believable. And because there was like such a heavy focus in this book on mental health, I feel like that character needs to be older and have gone through some stuff in order to kind of be that mentor figure almost to Cora, who does not have a support system and does not have anyone helping her as she kind of goes through her like crime and punishment descent into madness narrative.
Yeah, we talked about how, especially in like Truth of the Divine, like you talk about suicide and trauma from sort of multiple directions. Like this is obviously like really weighty topics to explore. What we're sort of what brought you to wanting to write about that sort of, wanting to explore these themes.
I think that was always kind of like the central relationship, like even before book one was even written or done, is like I kind of was starting from this very simple concept of like, ET heart bonding, almost a cliche of the genre at this point. But, instead of it just being like this childlike, we sense each other's souls thing, it's like basically two adults who are very deeply traumatized but don't really have the tools to deal with this, and so they don't. And I think that's true of most people. I think that like most people throughout history never really learned to deal with their trauma, even now, but especially like, in the past. And what often happens is like people kind of drag each other down because they don't ever really like develop the tools to help themselves. That it's just sort of that with this sort of added metaphysical component. And yeah, that, I guess that was sort of like the core concept everything else kind of branched out from.
Absolutely.
You deal with that both with Cora and Ampersand, but also with Nicola. And Nicola also is suicidal, but for a different reason.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of funny when you say like suicidal aliens. It's like no, it's not like that. It's like a cultural thing where it's like, because this is something that like I think is related to conversations we have now, because it's like something like I feel like if anyone watched had like a family member or someone they were close to and watched them die of like a very slow moving thing or something like Alzheimer's. Like my dad died of Parkinson's disease, and the whole time, like my mother especially was just like almost conniving ways like, if this happens to me, I'm going to move to Oregon, I'm going to move to a state where like I have this, I have the right to choose when and how I die, because I don't ever want to be like this. And it's because it's horrible. It's horrible watching people deteriorate slowly. And so I guess in my mind, I'm like, this, if, our lifespans do keep getting longer and longer, eventually it's going to turn into something like, well, we choose when we die. And so that being sort of a core component to this alien culture is like, well, we're very long lived and we choose when we die. We choose what our lifespans are. And that sort of being like one of this new character's motivations is like, well, we don't really have any reason to keep going, so I'm going to bump up our death date, and I say we do it right now because there's no reason to keep going. And so that being like but I don't know if everyone is on board with this, pal. Maybe put the brakes on a little bit, cool down, and let's talk this out once everybody is maybe like in a little bit of a better place.
What's the rush?
yeah it's like, because that is a thing that I think that could be abused, and that is part of the debate we're having now, is like if there is a serious rush, are you of sound mind? Are you doing this for the right reasons? Because obviously Nicola is not of sound mind. He's just using their like sort of cultural norm as an excuse.
Right.
Right. And that's why I was mentioning suicidal, because I know that with that cultural thing and the culture bonding of symphiles dying together, there's this whole cultural reason to do it together, but but Nicola's not doing it for that reason.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there like that's sort of a debate that like pops up in the third book is like, okay, so it's illegal here. However, that's us pushing our cultural norms onto them. So how do we deal with that? Like, do we change the law just for them? Because that doesn't make any sense. Because then we'd have to do it for everybody. So what do we do? And even here, I'm like, I don't know. I don't have a clear answer to that. It's a complicated thing. Although I do think that people should have more of a right to choose when and how they die. But
right. Another thing that you use as the central political debate of the second book is whether aliens are people, or what defines a person. And I know that that's been a big political debate in our world for other reasons. And you talk about
just reading about that this morning.
Yeah. You talk about the implications of that kind of denying personhood to aliens and what that would be. Do you want to go into that?
Yeah, I guess it's something that like I hadn't really seen done because I did talk to some lawyers about it, and it's just like, as often as we see sort of like Star Trek-y stories or alien invasion stories, like the question of like, well, okay, let's say they show up and it's like, okay, diplomacy time, everyone. How are they treated legally? Do they have rights if they, hit someone with a car? Is it vehicular manslaughter? Because like an animal can't be charged with manslaughter. And it was kind of like whenever I talked to lawyers about this, they were like, I don't actually know. I guess a law would have to be passed, because this isn't the sort of thing that like could, you wouldn't need like an amendment, like a constitutional amendment. But it would need to a law would need to be passed, because the way it works in the United States is, I forget what the term is, but like if it's not explicitly illegal, it is de facto legal. That's why some states like bestiality is technically legal, because there's nothing on the book saying it's illegal. And so yeah, fun fact, there are stories of people moving to Washington for that reason, and then Washington caught wise.
Wow. That's a really good fun fact, actually.
Yeah, there's a whole story behind that. I'm not going to get into it, but it's rather infamous in internet lore. But anyway, don't Google Mr. Hands. So yeah, it's just I think it's speaking of personhood, that was like one of like some of my friends were like, the pro-life activists would really get in on that, and I'm like, maybe we'll deal with that in a later book, because this book is already really long, but it's absolutely true. Because like the argument in favor, or one of the arguments against this idea of like denying aliens like full human rights, basically, is like this could be easily used to hurt like specifically immigrants, but basically anybody, depending on how the law is worded. Despite just being discriminatory and unethical. But on the flip side, it's I was reading an article this morning about this Native American woman in Oklahoma who had a miscarriage at 4 months and is now being charged with manslaughter on the basis of like fetal personhood, and and being like, well, all humans are persons, ergo, like, even if you're because I have to laugh, because it basically like had controlled substance in her system. That's why they're charging her with manslaughter, and it is starting to become an international incident. And so it's like either way, these can be, a law like this could be abused by all sorts of people who have unrelated agendas, because we see stuff like that happening even now.
Yeah. So going in a slightly different direction, you've done a lot of thinking about the backstory of this alien species, and their cultural development. What was your process of going through and creating the history of the amygdaline species and their origins?
Basically, it's kind of like starting, like working backwards from like this hypothetical evolutionary history. Really, I guess it's sort of like a like I think in order to get off of planet, there are certain likelihoods. Like you can't really be aquatic as a species. You gotta be able to like get on land and build stuff if you're gonna build a spaceship. You can't. You probably have some sort of like opposable fingers. You probably don't have that many limbs because evolution is lazy. Basically, I started with this idea of like. What is evolutionarily likely and how does bipedalism usually pop up on Earth? And, usually it's more like in the bird or dinosaur vein where it'll be like digitigrade. You like very, very rarely see plantigrade bipeds like humans. I guess kangaroos, technically. But yeah, so bipedalism is kind of rare and weird. And also like kind of imagining like a different like star, like if you like evolve a star with like a different type of sunlight, and if you evolved as like primarily herbivorous instead of omnivorous like we are, like what is your speaking of evolution, that is a dog that can't breathe. That is us destroying the mighty gray wolf. Oh, is the air quality bad, honey? What have we done to the mighty gray wolf?
See, they discovered we had couches.
Yeah, she this thing would not survive in the wild. But yeah, it was kind of a fun thought experiment of like asking a question of like, well, what will a post-natural human work look like, and then almost kind of like imagining like, well, okay, like let's imagine it was like an iguanodon or something that developed consciousness and intelligence and eventually became spacefaring. How would their, evolutionary history influence their culture, and how would that kind of influence what a post-natural version of that might look like? And just sort of after so long, like, would there be divergent species, which is also the case of these guys. They have like a sister species who is post-natural, but in a different way. Like they don't have cybernetic bodies. They have like meat bodies like we do. In a lot of ways, they're more common with humans. So yeah, it's just
so are we going to ever meet that sister species?
Yeah. Yeah, they're in the third book.
They're in the third book.
Yeah, they're in the third book.
So with the third book, I know you originally had 5 books planned. Are you going to get past the third book?
I don't know. It depends on and I mean, I guess it doesn't necessarily depend on them, like move to another publisher, but basically, yeah, I have a contact through 3. I guess we'll see where it goes from there. I feel like this kind of need a break.
Understood. So higher language. What is higher language? It's mentioned through the book, and you get a sense that maybe it's like machine code.
Yeah,
but,
that was our guess.
It's something like that. It's definitely machine augmented, but that's another thing we'll actually get into the logistics of in the third book.
Awesome. Looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's not a natural process. We'll put it that way. It's not like we evolved with this thing. Like, no, they didn't. What is wrong with you? We have, so I live in Long Beach, and as you know, there is a bit of a backlog with the ships because of supply. Right. And so right now there are like 18 billion ships just chilling in the harbor, pumping diesel gas into the atmosphere, and it is just like brown outside. So our air quality is just garbage right now.
My understanding is that the trucks are sitting in line waiting to get into the docks as well.
Yeah,
that's even more diesel. Yeah,
it's mostly the ships. There's just not enough trucks, but yeah, it's just like I've never seen the air quality this bad, and I've lived in LA for a few years.
Wow. I'd heard about this crisis, but I sort of didn't really know. I didn't have an image of physically where or what it was like.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as bad as it was. But yeah, we think that's why this dog just can't breathe. Because normally, like, because brachycephalic dogs, the ones with the squish face, they aren't good at breathing. They could not survive in the wild. But like normally, she doesn't have it that bad. So this is honestly unusual for her not to be able to breathe like this.
Right. No, poor thing.
What have we done
well,
to the mighty gray wolf?
Well, it sounds like that, with all the things that you're doing now, what are you excited about doing next?
I guess I can't really talk about it. I guess I'm working on the third book. I have a first draft done, so I'm waiting on editors to get back on that. Because usually the lion's share of the work when I write is revisions. Because I kind of see like first draft is where we get the structure in place. But like even though like because like the structure of Truth of the Divine didn't really change at all, but like it almost got like a probably 60% total rewrite from draft one to the final draft, just because like the way scenes unfold would change, like tone would change, motivations would change, even though the scenes themselves, like maybe the setting would change, but what happens in them doesn't generally. Or I might, add a couple of chapters just for character development, but like, yeah, that's what I'm working on right now.
I'm curious to hear a little bit about your process. From all right, we got through first draft. What comes next?
I'm one of those people like usually outlines really heavily. Big fan of Scrivener, especially for books like these, which are like epistolary, and so it's not just chapters, but I have like these interstitials that like move along. And I just cannot imagine writing something like this without that, especially like with multiple point of view characters. And, sometimes things need to go in a different order. And I'm just like, could not imagine writing this in Word and like rearranging chapters and interstitials and stuff. So yeah, I big fan of Scrivener and use that to outline. And then Truth of the Divine was so easy to write, and this third book is like, even though it's equally outlined, just like, so much harder. And I don't know why. I don't know why sometimes it, like Meatloaf says, sometimes it don't come easy and sometimes it don't come hard. Yeah, generally I'll write a first draft, send it out, comment, wait a couple of months to kind of get it out of my head, and then you get feedback to do revisions. And I think like Neil Gaiman once said something to the tune of like, whenever you get feedback and someone says this thing doesn't work, they're usually right, and if they say this is how you should fix it, they're usually wrong. And I've found that to be true. So I feel like most of the like ideas for what needs to be changed, I come up with. It generally takes a while to just kind of like flush the first draft out of my brain and come back at it as an editor, like I didn't write it, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense. I'm actually very curious about this part of it. Like that's a great quote, also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I feel like in general I'm a better than I am a writer, because I like editing other people's stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's it's a lot easier to see the flaws in a thing when you're not coming at it with your own biases and what you're trying to do. So that's why it is kind of important to like flush first out of your head in order to come back looking at it like an editor instead of a writer.
Right.
So with your video work for streaming, you do a lot of editing there too. Is that process similar or different?
It's very different. Because a lot of times I'll record something and then we'll edit it, and then I'll like have to add stuff or re-record it. But like, the tone is very different. It feels a lot more casual. It feels improvised, even though it's not. I guess like the only thing that I would find really helpful there is like, having practice and, figuring out what doesn't work about other people's media, like Game of Thrones, can help you figure out what works and what doesn't about your own work. But like nonfiction writing and like video essays is just like, it's completely different. I have like help for that. I have writers. I don't do those by myself. Yeah, it's just a completely different skill set.
Yeah.
Makes sense. What I've heard also that you're interested in music and musicals. Like, what fascinates you about those art forms?
I don't know. I guess part of it, like musicals are, I think, more than most things, kind of appeal to emotionality. Especially like as film trends more and more realistic. Theater, demands more suspension of disbelief. And there've been like a lot of really good productions lately. Just the other night I saw the 50th anniversary Jesus Christ Superstar tour. And a show like that is, basically it's all almost pantomime, where they're like, yeah, this is, they're not dressed like it's period. They use all sorts of things to kind of indicate like the biblical period, and like, glitter and palm fronds, and like the way they do Judas is really interesting. So I guess I like the creativity that comes with theater that is like so not literal. It's like so symbolic. It's almost kind of like the polar opposite of like the way film is trending. It's almost more abstract. So I feel like that's kind of what appeals to me about theater right now, because there's a lot of really good work going on.
Absolutely. Do you think that stories need or benefit from having, more than just written words to be, we've talked about a lot of different mediums of storytelling, to sort of like reach their full potential?
Yeah, I think it depends on the story. Like, I'm not a fan of musical movies. For the most part, like, I'm like, no, please don't act this. Please no Wicked. I don't like. I think Wicked, like Dear Evan Hansen, the movie, really made bare the flaws in the show, and people were like, oh, maybe this show always sucked. And I think that's gonna be what happens with Wicked, because like Wicked has a really nonsensical plot, especially in the second act, but you don't really notice, because it's like, it's very like high emotions and we're singing the whole time, and there's all these like grand set pieces. But like in film, it's like it kind of drags you back down to earth, because it's framed a different way. So I just feel like theater is the medium for musicals, and with a few exceptions like Moulin Rouge, which I think uses its medium really well and is one of the very, very few musicals to do so. I think it's just like that medium works well for that like story, where like Moulin Rouge the movie works better than Moulin Rouge the show, just because of like the way they use their respective mediums. So yeah, and that's what, because people keep asking me about like Axiom's End, the musical. I'm like, I think I'd rather eat glass, die. Like, no, and that is not the medium for this.
No, I don't think that would work very well.
Yeah, I get that you guys are trolling, but no, like, I don't know how, like, I can't even joke answer that. It's just,
I'm trying to think of musicals with like coherent, solid plots, and like the first one that comes to mind is like Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812.
Yeah.
Where they took a portion of War and Peace and like made it a musical.
Yeah, it was a very small portion. But I think like Les Mis is a good example of a show that's like one of the best, mediums of that story, because it like captures the emotionality of the story but moves really quickly, which is really difficult to do. But like in a way, it like gets the story across a lot more effectively than like the books, because it cuts out a lot of the like stuff that you don't really need. And then we move that into movie land, where it's like we're doing the same material, but like with that sort of like hyper gritty, realistic on location set, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely.
But King Kong the
So-
musical is an interesting. Yeah, there was a King Kong musical. It ran for like about 8 months on Broadway, and like I think that's what people are thinking of. They're like, there has been this trend for like, let's adapt things that have no business being musicals, but it'll be like
the Lambs, the musical.
Oh my god, yeah, it'll have like some really sophisticated set piece, and that's the reason people go see it. Because King Kong like was pretty bad. It was not a good musical, but it had like the best puppet. I even got like some Kong merch. He's sitting up there. But yeah, I got the King Kong plush from the King Kong musical. So the puppet was really cool, but gun to my head, I can't remember a single note of music from that show.
So in terms of your video essays about musicals or musical films, what would you recommend people to look at that you've done recently?
I guess anything to do with Phantom of the Opera. Yeah, we just did one on Love Never Dies, which is the sequel. And I guess like I did back in 2016, I did one on the movie Phantom of the Opera, which I guess sort of like was my thesis statement on, why movie musicals don't work. And when they do work, because I think Joel Schumacher just should not do musicals. So yeah, stuff like that. I did one on the Cats movie. People enjoyed that because I guess Cats is an easy target.
Well, that is true. Particularly the CGI in the movie was an interesting choice.
Yeah, so I guess obviously the same guy who did Les Mis did Cats, and also dragged Cats into this like really realistic style of filmmaking, which Cats is just like the worst thing you could apply realism to, and that ultimately I think is the problem with Cats the movie. People kind of focus on like the superficial stuff, but it's just like, no, Tom Hooper was the worst choice to do a live action. I mean, I think a live action Cats in general was a bad idea. It should have been animated, but that's just
that would have been adorable.
Should have been a little bit more psychedelic.
Yeah, they were working on one in the 90s, like back when Steven Spielberg's animation studio still existed. And they did some concept art that looked pretty cool. I don't think it would have been great, but it wouldn't have been like a trash hurricane like that we ended up with.
Speaking of Spielberg, what are your expectations for the upcoming West Side Story remake?
I don't know. I guess I don't really have any. Spielberg is another one of those filmmakers that I'm like, I don't really want to see you do musicals. But I'm kind of like a little disappointed that the West Side Story reboot that was on Broadway didn't survive COVID, because I was curious about it and heard good things. I was more interested in that than Spielberg's version, but I guess he's been kind of uninteresting to me for a while. Like after Ready Player One, I'm just like, oh, you just you don't really care anymore.
So focusing back on the Hugos, what other finalists in the various Hugo categories or the Lodestar that are not the Astounding are you excited about or looking forward to seeing if they win?
Well, I really liked Riot Baby. I kind of think that one's I saw that you guys already interviewed them. I kind of suspect that one is a favorite. Like those that made me really uncomfortable for about like an hour, and then it just kind of really stuck with me. So I'm kind of like rooting for that one for Novella.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. And then I think we touched on this last question about what do you think where do you think novels are heading over the next 2 years as we get all of the books that were written during the pandemic?
I have no idea. I think there's definitely more of a focus on reevaluating history and racial justice. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Because I think science fiction in general is like a genre that tends to question things, and I think that right now the audience is there for it. I think we're going to see less military sci-fi, because I think people are just kind of bored with it right now. But who knows? I could be wrong. Dune Resurgence is well, I know that's not really military sci-fi, but it's military sci-fi adjacent. Who knows? Maybe the re-interest in Dune will kick off a resurgence in like far future deep space exploration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, is there anything that you've got upcoming that we haven't talked about that you just want to plug?
No.
Great.
All right. Well, I want to make sure that people see your books. That this is Axiom and Truth of the Divine. They're both out now. Truth of the Divine came out in October, right?
Yeah.
So you should go and get them. They're incredible reads. And the third book is coming out next year. About when?
It'll be early 2022. So about 18 months. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've had a lot of fun talking to you.
Oh, thank you guys so much for having me.
Yeah, one of our staff members requested if we could meet the pup.
Oh yeah. You can see her right there, under Snoop Dogg, watching over us.
Thank you.
Come here.
Oh, hi.
I don't know if you can see her,
sweetie,
at the bottom of the screen.
There's a cute little face.
She's like, no, I'm going back to bed.
Right into the sun. Nice.
Yes, my sunbeam has arrived.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, have a good afternoon, you guys.
Thank you very much. And this has been Essence of Wonder without Gavi Evron. If you'd like to know more about Lindsay, you can check out her YouTube channel, Shay Apak Tube, and her website, www.lindsayl.is. If you liked our show, you can look for us on Facebook, YouTube, other streaming, Twitch, other streaming platforms, and subscribe, like, whatever it is. And we hope to see you in the future. We're going to be taking a break until January. A lot of our staff is involved with Worldcon. And since that's happening in mid-December, we're taking a month and a half off to do Worldcon. And we'll see you back after that.
Thank you. Have a great day.